It's so good to see so many of you here tonight for this very special event. I want to ask for a little bit of favor, just in case there are people who arrive late. If you're sitting next to an empty seat, scoot over a little bit so that people who do arrive late don't need to cause any commotion. But we're here. Welcome. It's the first event for our deep dive session that forms part of our History for Our Future Learning Network, which is a network that has been commissioned by the Mayor of London and led by House of Dread. My name is Dr. Alima Gray, and I am the founder of House of Dread. For those of you who don't know, House of Dread is an anti-disciplinary heritage studio that's really dedicated to the documentation, the preservation, the activation of histories of African and Caribbean lived experiences, of activating those. And we emphasize the anti-disciplinary nature of our work because we kind of recognize the slippery nature of what it means to be engaging in structural absence. And so therefore, we say we want to manifest something new. In Jamaica, we might say we want to start from over there as opposed to over here. So since March, we've kicked off with the network, and there's been, it's formed part of, a kind of cultivating a network of learning and sharing and creative responses and deep reflection on how we can understand the histories and the ongoing legacies of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans in London. But the network was really born out of a recognition that we really need more intimate spaces for reasoning, spaces that's not just about presenting knowledge, but, building it collectively through dialogue, through reflection, through deep commitment to a kind of, justice-orientated learning. So since we've started, we've brought together several different interventions. We've had networking days. Some of you have probably come to them. We've had feed-forward sessions, open calls, commissioning strands. There's been a lot of things that's been happening, and it's been really amazing to be a part of it. But this tonight is a very special one. It forms part of our deep dive session. And this is really about kind of specialist-led coming together of different topics that some of the network members have been putting forward. And so it's a very special one. Tonight, the title of the talk is kind of framed within this perspective of the digital is black, reparative methods of storytelling. And in framing tonight and in thinking about tonight is really seeing the digital not just as a tool, but as a kind of terrain, as a space that's kind of shaped by, power, access, and erasure, but also as these incredible acts of creative recovery and community. So whether we're talking about a map or, oral history or a film or an Instagram post, tonight is very much about storytelling that resists, storytelling that's deeply aware of the technologies it's using, and one that invites us to think about how we might use the digital as a way to look back, to look forward with clarity and agency. So despite this setup, which is very much a lecture style, I really hope it's not a lecture style. It's very much a reasoning, it's a conversation. I'm inviting everybody to think about, how can the digital media be a tool for reparative work? How do we as educators, creatives, community practitioners hold space for that emotional weight of these stories whilst also affirming the life and the culture and the futurity? So whether you're an educator, whether you're, or just somebody who deeply cares about these stories and how they shape the world, you're really part of this conversation. But anyway, because I'm conscious of time, we have a host of provocations with our esteemed panelists, Fiona, Compton, and Dr. Renee, Landell. But before I introduce them, I will be introducing the person who will be leading this conversation, or I guess starting us off with this conversation, Professor Vincent Brown. I must say, on a personal level, I was really honored and quite surprised when I put out the invite and you accepted it. Because I was like, wow, okay, this is good, because there was a time where I became very confused as a historian, and I became very like, but what go on in our real life? Particularly around methodologies. And I think a lot of I was listening to a reasoning that you had a long time ago, and you was encouraging us to think about, the creativity. And through that, I was able to navigate my own practice as a public historian. But Anyway, so let me introduce Professor Vincent Brown, historian, filmmaker, cartographer of resistance. His work is really foundational in showing how we can visualize the complexities of Atlantic slavery, not just through text, but through maps, through visual narratives and film. His project, The Reaper's Garden and Slave Revolt in Jamaica, are powerful examples of how digital humanities can be used to reframe history as a living, breathing terrain of Black agency and resistance. So without further ado, Professor Vincent Brown, thank you.
So I'm going to speak for about 90 minutes, and then... No. I think one of the things we'll do with our talk today, with our reasoning today, is really think about what an anti-disciplinary heritage studio means and what the way forward for that is. And one of the reasons I was so eager to accept this invitation, actually, is because I feel like House of Dread is something that, you know, if I had the imagination or the energy to create, I feel like I would have created it, and here it was already. And so I had to come and find out what it was about. And to be a part of it. And so I thank you for creating that space for me to join. So I'm grateful to both you and to House of Dread as an organization, a budding organization, for inviting me to this session, and especially to Fiona and Renee for coming to reason with me, as well as to all of you for joining us here this evening. But I also want to thank the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, for commissioning the history of our Future Learning Network. Coming from the United States, at this moment, I do not take, cannot take, support from political leadership for granted. Let's just put it that way. Alima has kindly asked me to help frame our discussion around some guiding questions having to do with narrative authority, that is, who gets to tell the story of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, and how do we disrupt dominant framings? Questions around digital humanities as repair. How can emerging technologies like film, archives, virtual reality, and et cetera, aid in building more just historical accounts? Questions around cartography and colonialism. How does mapping power, for instance, reconfigure how we visualize resistance? And then questions about pedagogy and emotion that I'm sure we'll get into when we have our broader discussion. What responsibility do we hold as educators and public historians to acknowledge grief while also affirming Black life, culture, and futurity? Now, I think these questions would be important to consider at any time, but they're especially vital now. I'm not going to address them completely in these brief prepared remarks, but I hope that we can work our way towards some answers together over the course of this evening. Now, I can't speak for how things are in the UK, but in the United States of America, Black history is under attack. A powerful racial nationalist movement hopes to control how we remember, teach, and represent history in the hope that they can shape a collective consciousness conducive to the far-right agenda. Some of you will have heard that earlier this week, the President of the United States complained that the nation's National Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, puts too much focus on how bad slavery was. Too much focus on how bad slavery was. As a historian of the subject, I can tell you that it was worse than he thinks. Much worse than people know. But that's not the point I want to make here this evening. Maybe you've seen something of the same in this country. Here, too, opponents of the vision for a more equitable future would prefer that we not think too much about the history of slavery and colonialism. Prominent critics have objected to the argument that the legacies of slavery might still be shaping our present. They react strongly, and have reacted strongly, to the iconoclasts who gathered under the banners of Rhodes Must Fall and Black Lives Matter, while explicitly tying the remaking of public institutions and public space to critiques of the ways that past social arrangements have been reproduced, with modifications often too slight to count as fundamental change. One of the leading young researchers in this area, Sabine Cadeau, has been clear that what she is deeply concerned with is how little this country knows about slavery, even leading historians. How we treat the history of slavery has everything to do with whether or not our societies will address its legacies at all, or if we will even recognize them when we see them. Now, of course, I don't have to tell you, it's rather strange to claim that the past makes no claims on the present in a country with a hereditary monarchy, hereditary peers in government, and hereditary debts paid by the public, as in the servicing of the money borrowed to pay slaveholders for the emancipation of the enslaved in the 1830s, and which was finally paid off only in 2015. Credit and debt accumulate or are worked off over time, just as the stigmas of color, class, and gender are inheritances that only transform with time. What is at stake here is not only some people's capacity to tell the truth about the past and its relationship to the present. As important as the effort to replace Black history with propaganda is the refusal to acknowledge Black perspectives on history more generally. This is a denial of our right to critically analyze all of our history from points of view that may be more common to Black people than others. Perspectives that emerge from a history of enslavement, impoverishment, and racial violence. Fundamental features of colonial and post-colonial experience that have frequently been disavowed. As the historian of education, Jarvis Givens, has said, to deny students the opportunity to critically study Black life and culture is to deny them the opportunity to think outside of racist mythology. Thinking outside of received mythologies and dominant framings can have a real impact on how we imagine connections between places, people, and time periods. And I want to show you an example of that from my own work now. So cue that, and I'll call for the film when I'm ready. The Anglican Church recently considered the fate of a memorial plaque at St. Peter's Church in Dorset, dedicated to an enslaver who helped to suppress Tacky's Revolt, the largest slave insurrection in the 18th century British Empire, which occurred in 1760 in Jamaica, the most profitable of Britain's American colonies at the time. Church leaders ultimately relocated the plaque to a local museum, keenly aware of the demonstrators that had recently toppled the statue of the slave trader and Bristol philanthropist Edward Colston, relocating it to the bottom of the River Avon. This film tells a brief version of that story of St. Peter's Church. So you can play that now.
John Gordon was basically a Scot on the make. He went to Jamaica to make his fortune as an attorney, managing plantations.
Like many British men in the 1700s, Gordon was drawn to the New World by the promise of wealth. Although wealth that came at a terrible human cost. By the time he died, he had his own plantations, but he also owned more than 400 enslaved people. In 1760, Jamaica witnessed the largest slave revolt in the 18th century British Empire, now known as Tacky's Revolt. Gordon acted as a kind of negotiator of sorts.
He was particularly keen to deal with the enslaved people who rebelled, and in fact to see if he could secure their release rather than execution.
But the rebels he helped to spare were exiled to other colonies.
John Gordon in 1774 was on his way back to Jamaica, having been in London, and he appears to have died here, probably on an overnight stay, and was buried in St. Peter's Church. And his brother put up a very large and elaborate memorial to him.
The only negative comments we get in the visitors' book are about that memorial, because it's not just a memorial to another wealthy 18th century man who made all his money in it. This explicitly praises him for quelling a slave rebellion. So we knew we had to do something about it, and the question was what?
Max Hebditch contacted me in 2020, after activists in Bristol had thrown the statue of Edward Colston into the river.
We were tremendously influenced by Vincent Brown's book on Tacky's Revolt.
Not only did the monument reference the subject of my research, I'm also really interested in how we make the past accountable to the present. What do we do about this history once we know about it?
Other memorials have come down, but for very different reasons. Contested heritage is new territory.
The people at St. Peter's Church wanted to know what I thought about the politics of monuments, but also about monument removals more generally.
There are two schools of thought about this. One is that it should be removed. Another is that it should remain, but have explanatory material related to it, because it is part of the history of this parish.
We started by considering the various options, putting up notice next to it, acknowledging its offensiveness, and the option of considering moving it to a museum.
Monuments commemorate history, but they generally commemorate the history of those in power, and they're often funded by the descendants of those who benefited from oppression.
The church is clear on its moral position. It doesn't take many people to acknowledge that slavery is wrong.
A great deal of our economy nationally is built on that.
The process of discerning what to do about it has taken 2.5 years. In the end, it was so much more appropriate for an important historic artifact like this, for it to be in a museum.
The latest label, because that's a different...
The director of the museum said he would be interested in having the monument because it was part of telling the story of how people made their money in the 18th century and acknowledging where the country's wealth came from.
The parcel tape was used to cover the offending words, but the museum would like the sort of recent additions removed.
The transfer will be another delicate operation to do.
Oh. Right, so down onto the front edge.
By moving it to the Dorset Museum, I hope that they can give it the context it deserves, acknowledging the history of enslavement, slave trading, and slave resistance, while educating ourselves and future generations. To remember enslavers is not to celebrate them. Rather, it's to acknowledge the dark legacy of their influence.
That's one of the reasons why it was very important that there was a proper place for it where it could be studied and examined.
History is vitally important because we all need to learn from it. It's such a cliche, but if you don't learn from it, it goes on repeating itself.
Okay, so one of the things that interests me about this story and this piece is actually what I'm going to admit to you is my own ambivalence about that last scene. One of the things I love about it is that it kind of refers to the last scene of one of my favorite films of all time, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is, you know, the putting away of the Ark in this vast storage hall where it no longer means much except, you know, item XXXXX among the stored items. But some time ago at Harvard University in the United States, I agreed to serve on a committee to consider the possibility of building a public monument to the enslaved on Harvard's campus. And that project appealed to me for personal reasons. The iconoclasm of 2020, attacks on Confederate monuments in the US and on statues of colonizers and slave traders, such as Cecil Rhodes and Edward Colston in the UK, showed that many wanted the memorials to enslavers removed from the public square. But I'll admit that I felt conflicted about the removal of statues. It wasn't that I thought people needed to respect monuments to slaveholders and imperial warlords. Rather, I was wary of engaging in a politics of erasure. I'd come to view such monuments as warnings more than honorifics. They marked a landscape of greed and brutality, reminders of the worst of human society, and where humanity should fear to return. I understood people's desire not to live in the shadows of these memorials, but I favored building more, better, and up-to-date monuments to reflect the values we wanted to project into the future, while at the same time leaving the others as a cautionary tale. Now, obviously, I wouldn't miss tributes to slaveholders, but I worried that removing them from view would erase the power of their negative example. I'm convinced that it is impossible to understand racial inequality, the way that poverty skews along color lines, the scourges of violent crime and violent policing, without a knowledge of the deep-seated processes originating in the past. If we do not learn that history in schools, where teachers are facing renewed attacks for educating students about the way the past shapes the present, at least we might encounter those lessons in the landscape. If we remove all the offending monuments, what would be commemorated in their place? Is the removal of the St. Peter's Church Memorial an appropriate relocation or an erasure? And I'm not totally sure. There are many such memorials in London. How should the landscape of memory be organized to ensure that the city represents all of its stakeholders honestly and fairly, but also so that we remember what this place has been, right? How this place came to be what it is. I think that question takes on added urgency when national governments, like my own, are committed to suppressing the critical study of empire, slavery, and racism. When we cannot count on schools, universities, and museums. But we must still then produce knowledge for ourselves. And the way we use our cultural media will determine the possibilities for doing so effectively. So this evening, I hope during our discussion we can figure out a way forward by thinking about the relationship between academic and the popular scholarship, the anti-disciplinary scholarship that we must create. And here, I just want to pause and express my admiration for Fiona and Renee. Fiona's work, as you'll hear, but as you should know already and probably do, with Know Your Caribbean, the Instagram platform, where followers learn about culture, history, and politics, has nearly 500,000 followers on Instagram. Now, I'm just going to admit to you right now, I don't think I've seen 500,000 students in my classrooms, even in the last 20 years, so respect. Renee's work is teaching us new perspectives on stereotypes, empire, critical cartography, and political resistance, all while working across different media environments. They've both taken advantage of a media landscape that was in its infancy when I began my career as a historian. The convergence of representational media, facilitated by the nearly ubiquitous profusion of computers, presents challenges and opportunities to customary ways of working. As we know, new media have enabled text, oration, graphics, objects, and even embodied performance to supplement or even constitute entirely new forms of scholarly and artistic production. Historical scholarship now includes open-ended and multi-form engagements, interactive and continually updating databases, cartographic applications that enrich places with historical information, online dialogues with peers and the public, in addition to films, television programs, audio shows, podcasts, and public performances. Digital media are tools that offer innovative methods of research and presentation, but new media must first and foremost perform the interpretive work of historians for it to teach history. Now, obviously, one need not be a digital historian or digital humanist to make significant use of digital applications. One needs only historical questions and a willingness to pursue them by any available means. Simply by asking what happened, when, and where can often tell us something important about why the past played out as it did and with what implications for the future. Because history never repeats itself, we look to the past to understand the ongoing processes that have shaped our world. By doing so, we might discern the scope, force, direction, and likelihood of the changes ahead, and be guided in our decisions by the example of our ancestors. My own work in this area has been inspired by scholars who have consistently worked around the predominant representations of the slave trade and slavery, tightly packed as they are with dull statistics, and towards some new, more evocative logic that might restore our sense of human experience to something so historically commonplace and yet so deeply alien to our common sense as the social relations of slavery. This is a special concern of my own as a historian with a stubborn interest in exploring and telling history from below. Over the last decade, I've been working in Harvard University's History Design Studio to join a commitment to the professional practice of history with an experimental approach to form and presentation. Our goal has always been to embed historians' core values and methods in the innovative products of artisanship and craft, extensive use of primary sources, attention to processes of change over time, keen historiographical awareness, and an overarching respect for evidence form the basis of projects in multimedia storytelling and analysis. Thinking creatively, as Alima said, about the design and presentation of our research, we've attempted to stretch the canvas of historical scholarship. But in our efforts, we consistently face the challenge of developing protocols for making credible claims to the truth, even as the media we use to interpret the world are changing rapidly. And I think the challenge is made especially acute by two things. First, the profusion of creators and influencers telling history to large audiences. And second, the decline in the authority of institutional gatekeepers. Both of these trends have both virtues and limitations that I want to talk about now. Among the virtues, fresh ideas come from the public, and people who are not disciplined by professional life to brush aside basic questions or public concerns can emerge. This keeps historical storytelling engaged with a broader audience and open to reconsideration and reevaluation. This can create a demand for more just historical accounts and encourage public memory workers to be accountable to the present. There's a great potential in the new media environment to disrupt dominant framings, allowing ideas to emerge from below. Social media reminds us, too, that knowledge is a collaborative process. Many historians still subscribe to a monastic ideal of scholarship that emphasizes long years of solitary contemplation, or a romantic ideal in which the heroic individual descends into a little-known repository and emerges triumphant with a gift of new knowledge for the world's admiration. I told you I'm a Raiders of the Lost Ark fan. But if these archetypes ever approximated reality, and I don't think they did, few new media projects would develop along such lines, and we can't even have that mythology about them. But the limitations of digital scholarship, I think, are as serious as the virtues. The most obvious of these limitations are the profusion of misinformation and political propaganda, marketing promotions, and now AI-driven slop. The abundant and often well-deserved criticism of professional academics sometimes overlook what has made universities a source of enduring knowledge in the first place. The most important factors to my mind are time, peer review, and verification. The speed of computing and communication technology has not eliminated the need for slow, immersive contemplation. When it comes to history, I think this is as true for learning as it is for research and teaching. People are less patient with websites and social media than with printed texts. What can be learned in the abbreviated intervals of digital scrolling? One can certainly glean a summary argument and an impressionistic sense of its content, and one can feel the attractive pleasure of novelty. Such things happen quickly with the interpretation of condensed symbols. But it is likely, too, that such speed and ease of access works against historians' effort to teach about complex processes that unfold unpredictably over space and time. Also, an important standard of academic research has been the requirement that scholars be able to show the evidence for their findings and to offer interpretations that can be shown to flow from that evidence. In text and print, historians use footnotes to their sources to convey this transparency, a practice that does not translate across all media forms. The authority of an argument and the veracity of a story is supposed to be conveyed more by the arrangement and interpretation of evidence than by the rhetorical prowess of the author. The direct forms of communication in social media often invert this emphasis, often with the charisma of the presenter or influencer being more important than the demonstration of the research itself. Academic researchers subject their studies to review by their peers. While these professional communities of interpretation are not always responsive to more public concerns, if ever, they have an essential vetting function. It's how we separate sound and enduring claims from froth. Now, I am honored to call Fiona Compton and Dr. Renee Landell my peers. But what I want to discuss now is how they, and all of you assembled with us, think we can build on the possibilities of the new media environment while retaining the best features of patient, open-ended research, proof and verification, and critical professional review. So, how much discipline must we impose on our anti-disciplinary heritage efforts? Let's talk about that now.
I got so caught up in writing notes that I forgot that I have to come back here. But I'm going to welcome our panelists now. We're going to chop it up. We're going to have a little reasoning, and I'm sure all of you in the room, you probably also have reflections and questions, etc. So I'm going to invite. You kind of did a little introduction of them, but I'm going to invite R&C. I'm going to invite Fiona Compton. Fiona Compton is a Caribbean storyteller, historian, and artist who has dedicated her life to amplifying the rich history and culture of the region. A proud daughter of St. Lucia, Fiona is the founder of Know Your Caribbean, which I'm sure everybody in this room is following. A groundbreaking platform that has become the world's premier resource for Caribbean history, reaching over 500,000 followers globally. I'm also going to invite Renee, Dr. Renee Landell, who is a literary and cultural scholar, visual artist, writer, and public speaker. She recently completed her PhD with the thesis entitled Rerun Things No Runway, Black Humanity and the Non-Human World in Caribbean Neo-Slave Narratives. Wow, we need to take some sacred pause. But she's also the heading up project manager at Mapping Black London, which I'm sure Renee is going to speak a little bit more about, multiracial past and equitable futures. So let's round of applause for everybody, and let's come. There's some water there as well. Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
I don't know if we should pick them up or maybe I should pick up one.
So, a lot to say. I wanted to start with perhaps the place that you ended, Professor Brown, which is, I guess, more around thinking about, and it's something that has come up in the video that we watched, but this interpretation, which of course is at the heart of a lot of historical practices, but also our responsibility within the digital realm. So that storytelling element of it. And also those questions around authority. Who gets to tell these stories and how we're telling it? And who are we even in conversation with? Which as a curator is always a question that I'm constantly thinking about. So I'm going to pass, I guess, some initial reflections. Maybe Fiona, if you want to start with some of the things that you've been thinking through.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, of course, with 2020, you've been seeing so many statues coming down across UK, US, and even like in the Caribbean too. I think Martinique was the first in 2019, and then, you'd find that even people in Martinique were arrested. The French police were flown down from France. So you see a lot of very intense response to these things happening. And I personally love to find these discoveries in these small enclaves, like a little church in Dorset. Like the other day, they found a similar honoring of someone who had fought against Chief Chataye in St. Vincent underneath a rug in a church. And then the question of who, as how do we reframe these, the removing of them? And I remember when, I don't know if you had heard about the project with, they're doing it with Robert Cass and Beckford's statues in Aldgate, and they're looking for historians to come to rewrite the plaques, because they're not going to take down the statues. They wanted to rewrite the plaques, and I had applied for it, and then I say, nah, I don't want to do it, because I felt like the emotional labor was a lot. And again, the question is, who am I talking to? Because me as a Caribbean woman, and then having a conversation with the predominantly white public, white British public who are going to be engaging, and how am I going to say it? So, I mean, I don't know if I could answer your question, because I feel very passionate, like I'm working on something, doing a renaming of an area in St. Lucia, and that in itself, in a Caribbean space, has been met with a lot of resistance. So even within our own spaces where you think like, okay, Caribbean people will be like, yeah, let's take it down, even that too, we have to work through. So I don't know if I could answer. I just do feel very passionate about addressing it and talking and doing it respectfully. And even too, right? So with the one in Dorset and things like that, how can you really encompass the fullness of the story with a little plaque underneath, a little asterisk? By the way, this person wasn't, so I don't know. I don't know the full answer to that, to be honest.
Which there's an element of that I don't know, and an element of unknowing, which actually really charge and shapes the work, right? Is that element of the speculation. Renee, I don't know if you have to.
Yeah, I think it's really a really important question. And I was thinking about symbols and symbolic power, something that I talk about quite a bit. And what I really liked at the end of the documentary is that you came to the conclusion that the best place for it was a museum. Because I think oftentimes when we're thinking about slavery and colonialism, we want to say it's black history, right? But actually, this is white history at its peak. And so I think when you're thinking about the spatialization of monuments can be so powerful. And it takes me back to thinking about the monarchy. Somebody said, I have beef against the monarchy, obviously. I'm a slavery studies scholar. But somebody said to me, but why are you so concerned right now? Because the monarchy are just symbolic. They don't really hold power. And actually, in my line of research, I look at symbolization, I look at mythologization, I look at stereotypes, as you mentioned. And symbolic power is one of the most violent forms of power that exists today and existed back then. And so I am of the kind of theoretical belief that abolition is the only way. So, abolish the monarchy, that's me. And so I think about that in line of these monuments, and a kind of form of abolishing can be removing them and moving them in the proper right spatial context, right? And somebody said, I think the question came up in the video of what could we replace these with? And Mapping Black London do this so well. We think about the early black presence of Black Britons, right? Pre-Windrush. So we're talking 16th century. As far back as the 17th, 16th century. And I'm thinking there are some really amazing Black Britons that existed. Ignatius Sancho, Mary Prince, Phyllis Wheatley, John Blank. I mean, where are their statues? And that's a good question to ask.
Yeah, and our statues the best way to represent them and their place in our history. I think, a lot of people take the symbolic landscape for granted, which is why, you can have, say, a bay in the Caribbean named after a great British admiral. And people just think, well, that's the way it's always been, right? That's the way it should be. And when you go to try and rename a thing, then people get upset. Sometimes people you wouldn't expect to getting upset because they haven't asked the question to themselves. And so for me, I guess some of the work is constantly unsettling the taken for granted nature of the symbolic landscape, to try and add stories where they're not expected, to try and disrupt, as you say, dominant framings of a thing, so people can actually begin to think again about how things got to be the way they are, rather than just assuming that the way things are is natural or is God-given. And that's why I appreciate your work so much, is because you engage, the audience at a level of what are we seeing around us, what should we understand about our landscape to make it reflect our own lives, our own hopes and desires, and not just the professional concerns of academic historians. And I think that work is vitally powerful. It's why it needs to come out of universities and out of museums even, and into the hands of people who are living with history every day and living with symbolic landscapes that they sometimes don't think enough about, but probably should.
I wanted to circle back to something that you brought up in your reflections, Fiona, which is about the emotion and affect. It's something that comes up a lot within the approaches to telling stories. You know, these histories that we're dealing with is very much living, is embodied, is felt, it's painful at times. Sometimes you don't know what to do with the emotion. You know, some of us, we tune into music, we tune into... So there's an element of that kind of emotional weight of this work. So how do you navigate that, you know? I know it's a very big question, but what are the tools or the methodologies that help you in navigating that? And I'm also going to add another question in addition, and this is for everybody, because it's something that I've been thinking through a lot. And I was thinking about it as well when I was watching the documentary, which is a very simple thing, but it's like, what is the question that we're actually asking here, you know? So, yeah, sorry, Fiona.
It was to answer your first question, soca, dancehall, whining, going and sleep early. Like, there's lots of things. And I think carnival, like, there's, because I feel like I have to, I think, y'all are historians, y'all know. We can read through some, like, really tough, like, traumatic stuff, and then we cool, right? And then one day you read one sentence, and it'll mash you up for the whole week. And like you just there, like, and you want to, and then it's like, who do you talk to? That's something I struggle with, because like I can tell my friends, like, yo, this man did this thing, and it's more painful because I know the context, I know the timeline, I know why 1734 is an important year, because this happened, and so that's why this awful thing is like extremely awful, and it is something that I struggle with. Sometimes I take breaks. I go to sleep very early. In St. Lucia, like, 9 o'clock, 9:30, I'm done. But I try to pace myself. I think what I do struggle with is sometimes, because people say, oh, well, what drives you, what keeps you going, and thing. And I say, well, sometimes I will be there, and then I'll be going through something, and then I say, I'm tired. And I'll just hear a voice say, don't forget me, please. Just turn a page, don't forget me. Like, I do feel spirits are guiding me a lot of times. I look at something I've written, I say, me that write that? Like, I know that's not really me. It's like, I feel like things I'm driven by something that is a need, is if it is for me to uncover myself, uncover my people, or if it is like voices are telling me, like a cry of, please don't forget me. Because I remember someone said to me, it takes 2 generations for you to be forgotten. Most of us don't know our great-great-grandparents' names or much about their lives at all. And then, you know, looking at the things that shape us, so like, you know, looking at like New York Caribbean and stuff, like we're talking about coming out of universities and in the academic space, right? I'm not an academically trained historian, it's just me through my own self thing. And then it's like our history is part of us all the time. So like I'll read something and say, the breeding of Negroes, and I'll be like, then I'll hear Vibes Cartel, girl, me want breed you, and I'm like, oh. So looking at how that, you know, that piece of history has even permeated into dancehall. And so it's inescapable. So I do a lot of things like in terms of physical release, so dance is really important. Listening to soca music is a big release for me. And then and resting, because I find it hard. And then I think in a digital space and like sharing these histories as well, there's not enough space for nuance. And I feel like with New York Caribbean, I'm reaching a frustration of there's only so much I can talk about things on Instagram. Yeah.
So I want to amplify something you just said with another story, and I'm in perfect agreement with you, and then pose a challenge as well for all of us. I once had a conversation with an emergency room doctor, and I asked him how he could possibly do that work, that life and death work all the time. And I'm not going to compare historians to emergency room doctors. I don't think I'm that important. But it was about the emotional state that he could be in order to do that work. And he said, usually I have to bracket my emotions and go in and do and respect my training. I've done this, I have experience, I kind of have a reasoned out sense of like how the body works, what medicine does. And when I go into the emergency room, I have to execute that without feeling everything. But just as you said, he said, once I had to operate on a child, and that child died, and I broke down for a week, right? So I feel like there's, to some degree, historians have to do that as well. You're reading these documents, it's brutal stuff, and you bracket your emotional response for some time in order to analyze it, to see the patterns, to think about the connections, to come up with the interpretation that you think is reasonable. But then if you don't remember the humanity of those people and your own, if you don't remember why this matters in the first place, and what kind of emotional connection you need to have with the material and your readers or your audience needs to have with that material, then what are you really doing? And so there's a kind of two-step process where you both have to bracket it for a time, but then come back and reinvest that work with that affect, with that emotional commitment, so you can understand why it matters. Because otherwise it just doesn't. It's dry. And people will see it as dry. But I want to pose a challenge to that way of thinking too, which is that, say I'm a white racial nationalist defended from white racists, maybe even slaveholders. And, when I listen to country music and I dance my line dancing, it's my ancestors telling me that racism is a true reflection, a true interpretation of the world, right? If my emotional response makes me feel like racism, far-right nationalism is the truth, how can we critique that with just a different emotional truth, with a different understanding of what our ancestors are telling us, right? Where's the place in which we can engage that felt, understood, known truth that sees us as enemies, right, to be defeated, as opposed to common human beings, right, to be collaborated with in what hopefully might be one day a democratic project again. I mean, I wrestle with that all the time, which is there are a lot of things I kind of know to be true, but I have to figure out how to prove that they're true, even in terms that someone who doesn't want to acknowledge my truths can understand. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Like, where do we go with that? How do we develop protocols that are going to be undeniable when we go to tell our history, or when we go to tell like our truths about white people's history to them?
I think it really speaks to this kind of dichotomy when we're talking about history, this kind of battling between what is historical truth and what is kind of lived reality, but also personal experience. And I think a lot of historians have asked this question, right? Like, how true can history be, right? And so I understand that question to the point of it's something that has constantly bothered me during my research, just constantly bothered me. Not because I ever have doubt in what I'm learning or what I'm discovering or whatever else, but simply because I know what you're saying is true, that some people have their own truth and they can back it up with versions of history that they can deem as their interpretations and so forth. But I think one thing that I do is when I have a theory that I'm about to expand on, about to write an article, I will challenge myself. I will ask myself opposing questions. And I challenge myself, I debate with myself enough till I come to a point where I'm so kind of beaten up almost that I'm left with like the scraps, and all I can really face now is reality. And I think if we encourage people to do that with their own theories, with their own beliefs, wherever they have stemmed from, it could be generational, it could be based on religion, it could be based on politics, whatever the case may be. I think as humans, the best thing that we can offer ourselves and other people is the debate, the internal debate, constantly challenging our own thoughts, challenging where these come from and how we can grow as individuals. What does growth even look like?
I envy you all in Britain right now, because in the United States, in many states in the Union, right? And with executive orders at the federal level, laws are being passed to ban history that makes white people feel bad, right?
There we go.
If they feel shame when they read about slavery, and I don't know why they have to identify with slaveholders in the first place. I mean, they don't have to necessarily. I identify with Indiana Jones, so like, they can identify with Chief Tacky or Queen Nanny, I would assume. But there are laws being passed, right, to preserve the feelings of people in classrooms so they don't have to encounter history that makes them feel bad.
Yeah, I think there's also something about, like, there's definitely something about the feeling and the emotion and the affect. And there's also this elements of absence and erasure, which comes up time and time again. Yeah. We're constantly working within, under, moving, navigating with erasure. So that idea of truth claims and proof, but also for many of us, and this is me more speaking from more of a personal perspective, we come to a point as a Jamaican that's been displaced in London, where we don't trust history anymore. That relationship with trust isn't there. Yeah. So this is why that critical discourse, those critical engagements is so important. But this is also what we mean when we say antidisciplinary, is understanding that process of how knowledge is produced is part of the knowledge itself. And also in that zone of the unknowing of sometime, and it's a challenge as well, even within House of Dread, is like, how can I prove what I'm saying? Because I feel it, I know it's true.
So let's stay with that. Like,
right.
What have you found helps to build trust in the historical narratives and interpretations that you want to espouse?
I think it's being honest in what you know and what you don't know, and being comfortable within that zone of that unknowing. And I think if there's anything that becoming a doctor of history has taught me, is that I don't know anything at all. Do you know, it's strange. I went into a PhD process or the academy and I left like, say I don't know anything. So I think it's like just that honesty to be like, this is what I'm working with, this is what I'm feeling. I don't really know, but I'm on this journey and I'm navigating. And some might say it's history from below, or some others might say, it's history from the corner. We're there up on the corner, just watching. So, but what I did want to talk about before putting it out into the to those of you who's listening, I even forget that people's here listening. I feel like I'm in a living room. It's really about because you spoke about it, Professor Brown, you spoke about this kind of, the tensions between the digital realm, because, this event is about the digital being black. These spaces of opportunities, but then also the underbelly of the misinformation. Obviously, a lot of this speaks to your work, Fiona. How do you, I guess the economy, that kind of attention deficit economy that we're in, and how how are you navigating this with your platform, Know Your Caribbean?
Can I piggyback on your question?
Yes.
And just ask you first, why do you have 500,000 followers?
I don't know. People ask me, I don't have an answer.
We need to know. We're trying to figure this out.
I don't know, because I will put like some hard emotional investment in a post. I'm like, yeah, people really gonna feel this one, and then it will like boom, and then you see some trivial foolishness, and everyone is on it. I'm like, this is what y'all care about, really? So I'm still learning. But so how I started Know Your Caribbean, I want to shout out my mom who's in the back. She is a historian in her own right, because I grew up, and Professor Brown has been to my house, fortunately, and he got to see all the maps. And I think my mom is a collector. Postcards, like she has this huge, like amazing collection. And it was during the time when it's like 2004 kind of vibe, eBay just started to become a thing. And she'd be calling, Fiona, we need to bid on this postcard. It's ending in 2 minutes now. I'm like, yo, I'm on a tube just now, mommy. But it was, and I would see these old images of St. Lucia from like 1890. I'm like, wow, this is beautiful. And they're wearing the same things that my mother used to force me to wear in these cultural events that I hated and now I love. And so I saw me in them in me, right? And that's how I was like, so I just started on Instagram, hey, yo, look at this cool picture. This is amazing. And then someone said, oh, you should add some more context. And then during this time, I was graduating. I had studied photography at London College of Printing. I hated my degree course, especially in the last year, because I felt there was like no representation of myself. I felt that it did, and I left the degree very frustrated, and that's how I started to do like this hyper focus on Caribbean culture, because I felt like we're not being represented like at all. And then it just became this rabbit hole of things. I learned about the Haitian Revolution and so on. But to answer your question, so that's how Know Your Caribbean started. Me just sharing some of my mom's postcards and just having that inquisitiveness. And then finding out things. So in the beginning, you hear a lot about, trauma porn and clickbait. I don't know if I was clickbaiting, but I was sharing the horrific things I was finding out. So it was actually the story from Antigua Prince Class. And, Prince Class was an enslaved man, and he had orchestrated this revolt, and it ended very violently. And so I shared, this image of him being broken at the wheel, and look how horrible this is. How could they do this to our people, and so on. This is now maybe 8-9 years ago. And then years later, I came across randomly the Pennsylvania Gazette, whatever, and I was like, why does the Pennsylvania Gazette have this very detailed piece of history? And he's talking about how he did this war dance, and he had this thing with these feathers, and there was like rum and gunpowder and cock's blood and a sword and all these beautiful things, and like, wow, and like none of that is spoken about. And so that's the part of the history I wanted to share. Like, yo, that's gangster. Like, he went in front of the plantation house and he did this war dance, and so I found joy in like a very painful story. And so that's more the things that I wanted to share. Like, wow, I didn't know that. And kind of reshaping that history, because like me, yes, I grew up in St. Lucia. I had all of the Caribbean schooling. I dropped history when I was about 14, 15, Form 3, because I thought it incredibly boring. And then I came back into it, as we say, as a hardback woman. I was a big woman, and so but the difficulty I'm having now with Know Your Caribbean is having like real conversations, talking about nuance. Even like, for example, looking at like the Maroons. And, finding about, the Maroons with General Fife and their relationship with the British. And I'm like, it's not as simple as that, and having those more detailed conversations. And, other things with nuance, with Caribbean identity, I struggle with on the platform. So it's because I want to bring things to a deeper level, and I feel like I can. So I share a lot of things, but I do feel frustrated. Yeah, I do. And it's because, and I think, it's great that people applaud the platform for bringing it, like, outside of like the academic space and things like that. But I think now that we're reaching a point where we need to have a lot more nuanced and difficult conversations. A lot of times, people just be quarreling. I will post something like about happiness, joy, or dance, and I'm just see people arguing, and because we're not listening to each other anymore. We're talking at each other, not to. Yeah.
I was going to say for you, Renee, it's slightly different, I suppose. I'm thinking about, mapping Black London.
Yeah.
And the way in which you're engaging, using digital tools to kind of do that work. How do you navigate that space? Yeah, and I'm saying this, please think of any questions as well before I put it out there.
This is why I actually really love the title of this session, The Digital is Black. I'm going to get on to Mapping Black London, but I want to say, in my kind of thinking about the title, I was thinking, if we are to say that the digital is black, we are then saying that there are technologies of resistance, that it's so radical, not only radical because it encourages liberation and it memorializes history, it causes us to remember, but it's also radical in terms of access. And Professor Brown was talking about this earlier so succinctly and so perfectly. It encourages access in a way that in the UK, as was stated in the keynote discussion, in the UK, the curriculum, there is no place for Black history. So there is an attack on Black history in America, but I guess the attack on Black history in the UK is that it's completely ignored. There isn't a place for it at all. And the little bits that we do learn it in the curriculum, maybe about slavery, maybe about some figures. It's all in an American context. So the best thing that Britain does is distance itself from that history. Britain's been so good with that. They said, we'll just enslave people islands away and whatever else, and no one's ever going to remember 100 years from now that it was us. They've done that so well. And so to say that the digital is black is to say that there are technologies of resistance. And Mapping Black London, so Mapping Black London is a digital research project at Northeastern University. And essentially, the research team, we have one in the audience. Our research team, we have a research team in London and we have a research team in Boston. And again, the Boston team are facing some of the same issues, so we're having to take a lot of the workload on. We essentially create digital maps, but also physical exhibits as well, that trace the lives and experiences of early Black Britons, like Ignatius Sancho, as I said before. And the research team have done a wonderful job in picking out parish records, marriage records, baptism certificates, thinking of locations at churches, and really extensive work. And what I really want to say about Mapping Black London and the digital being black is that when we're talking about resistance, we have to come back to the question of access. Especially when there are countries around the world like America where these histories, there are attacks. So how can we navigate that when in academia and in our institutions they're refusing to recognize this history? We turn to the digital, right? We turn to spaces where we have access, the public has access, and the best thing about that actually as well, and thinking about Britain, is thinking about families who are more disadvantaged, right? They might not have access to archives because archives are restricted. They might not have access to certain books and articles because they're often behind a paywall, right? But if you do a digital map and upload it to your website, everybody can access that. And that's what we found. The access is what makes the digital black as a form of resistance.
So I think this is to all of you. In terms of access, right? So for example, I love going up in the archives, National Archives, right? It's free. British Museum is free. British Library is free. All these things are free, and they will say, but what you mean? Everyone has access, everyone can come. But as if to me, that, like for me, I feel like there's an invisible wall of like, I don't feel comfortable. Like I have to like just take a deep breath before walking into some of those spaces. How do y'all feel about, y'all have worked with so many institutions and so on. How do you break out of that? Or is it us? Are we the problem? Or is the institution the problem? Like, what is it? They say it's free, you can come. And we don't go. Why is it that we don't go?
Can I just jump in really, really quickly? I think that's because one of the things I talk about in my research is the racialization of space and the spatialization of race. The British Museum, really? We're talking about access. It's one of the most violent spaces we as black people could ever go to, the British Library. So yes, they might be free and they might have, access. But it's still a place of harm for us. And again, it comes back to symbols and that kind of feeling. So I would just say we really have to circle back to the spatialization of race. And it's not something we just imagine and it's just in our heads. It's real for us.
I want to answer that, but I want to circle back to something Renee said that I think is so important. It's about the kind of consistent everyday erasure of black history in the UK. One of the reasons I wanted to make that little film about the removal of that monument is because the reason they wanted to remove it, as the woman said, is that they were getting a lot of negative commentary on that, and they wanted to get rid of it. They were embarrassed by it. And so the first option was just to cover part of it up, and then finally to just move it out of the church so that they could not actually deal with the connection between England and Jamaica, right? And not have people comment on that anymore. So that itself was a kind of erasure. And yeah, that's its own kind of thing we have to deal with. That leads to like my engagement with these violent archival spaces. And I guess I've been doing this for so long, I think I have to learn from you guys what it's like for people who are not trained historians, who have been doing this for 30 years, to go into those spaces. But I know that when I first began to do this research, I kind of felt like I was doing undercover work. And still there's an element of that in even the last book I wrote on Tacky's Revolt, which is a lot of the research for that was done here at the National Maritime Museum and at the National Archives at Kew. And I was looking at military records. I was looking at Royal Navy records. And most people who look at those Royal Navy records, they're kind of looking for the history of Admiral Nelson or maybe, some ancestor's unit in a war that they've heard of. But also in those records are the daily logs of the lieutenants and the masters of ships and the captains. And they're sailing around the Caribbean suppressing a slave revolt and noting it down. Now, most people just look straight past that on their way to a conventional military history. And for me, the trick was, how can I kind of take all the tools of military history and do something with them that the military historians never did? To imagine a slave revolt as part of a British imperial war, which it in fact was. It's just been consistently disavowed since the 18th century, right? So there's a real virtue and value in kind of going into those spaces, dealing with those records and writing different kinds of histories, reinterpreting them for our purposes, so that we can speak to each other about what was really going on. But then we still have to have some standard for saying, like, look, I found this in the primary documents, right, produced during that period. You cannot tell me this did not happen, right? You cannot wish it away simply by covering up the plaque or removing it to a museum, right? This is what's in the archives that we all think is where we go to find history, and this happened. And you've got to tell the story, and you've got to regard it.
I'm going to pass it out into the audience. Just checking in, how we're all doing. I have a lot to say, but I know I'm going to take over too much, so I'm trying to keep quiet. But it's hard, because it's hard. So I'm gonna, we have a row. No, you know what, because if I speak, I spoke. It's going, I'm conscious of time as well. But checking in with those of you in the room, what are your thoughts or your reflections or questions? Anybody? Okay, quite a few. Oh, okay.
She gave me a microphone. Hi, my name is Abira. I'm a doctoral researcher at UCL within the Information Studies Department, looking at kind of Somali diaspora histories. I want to thank Alima for doing this amazing talk and organising this. I feel so much resonance with what was discussed, and I think I was initially thinking about the last comment you made, Professor, around how much discipline in anti-discipline, and thinking about this tension between different knowledge systems or epistemologies, both the kind of positivist and kind of more constructivist, or even kind of the book that I refer to often, the archive and the repertoire, and the kind of tensions between text and oral, embodied and gestural, and kind of how sometimes they are often seen as one or the other, and thinking about the digital as a space for the dialectic and not necessarily a synthesis. And I guess part of it was thinking about, particularly when the discipline is something that was part of, I guess, part of the kind of apparatus of colonialism, and kind of what foregrounded and was part of, I guess, anthropology, and foregrounding kind of the means for categorizing and justifying the other, and colonialism as well. And I know, sorry, this is like a reflection and a question, but I guess the point I'm trying to, and I was mentioning from a previous discussion, thinking a lot about David Scott's work around kind of problem spaces, and what is the question, kind of thinking more about the question rather than trying to address the answer, or what were the things that led to the question, or led to these answers. But I guess for me, I'm thinking about how do we imagine and use digital in a way that neither enmeshes with Europe or tries to assimilate with Africa. How much do we assign to Europe? How much? Because often I feel like when we're doing this type of work, it's very much about representing in kind of opposition. And most of that is often still kind of either using the same kind of logics or the same epistemic terrain as Europe, or not taking into the fact that things, I guess being in the diaspora gives us the opportunity to see kind of this plurality that allows us to hold both. And I guess for me, I guess I'm still trying to think about how can we use digital to think of things in a more kind of maybe transformative or generative or discursive or something that's always evolving, because there isn't, I guess when I talk about the kind of the opposition, there isn't an origin or a pure kind of African history that we can kind of go back to, or it never really existed in the first place. And so it's always been something that's been fluid. So I guess my question is how can we use digital as something that's fluid?
Thank you.
I feel like, to some degree, you've answered your question, right?
I wanted to say the
But
same thing.
in suggesting, as I think is absolutely right, that what we're trying to do is build something transformative, which requires us thinking about the positive values that go into our work and not just what we're resisting. Not just, as you say, kind of assigning certain ideas, practices, technologies to Europe meaning bad or Africa meaning good. That's not that helpful to us. But it's really to think positively about what kind of world are we trying to build, what are the values that might help to get us there, and then what kinds of stories do we need to tell, what kinds of arguments do we need to make, what kinds of structures do we need to build to make that world more possible. And so I'm completely with you in reorienting us toward thinking positively about the content, right, and the rules, as I keep saying, the protocols for building a much more just and equitable world. There are a lot of people who don't want to do that at all, right? They would like a rigidly hierarchical world with themselves at the top and other people who they think deserve to be less than them permanently at the bottom. And they're telling stories, right, that make that world seem natural. And they're using felt truths. They're using postmodern discourse. They're using all the same technologies that we'd like to use. But the real problem is the world they're trying to build, which is ugly and destructive and leading nowhere. And I think that's where we have to place our emphasis, is on the virtues of the world we're trying to build and the rules that we think we're going to need in order to make it more likely and possible.
Thank you. I know that there's so many other questions, so I'm sorry, Nana. I feel like I need to get on my foot and help you.
Yeah. We're going to go with Amber Lee, and then I think you had your hand up next, and then we'll come to some others.
I also feel like there's just so much in my mind, and I'm going to try my hardest to reflect in a question that is also clear, because there's still so many things that I'm processing from all the things that you've shared. So thank you, everybody. My name's Amber Lee. I'm an academic. I'm a lecturer in psychology and inclusive practices, and my research is actually looking at psychological safety for Black academics in the institution and thinking about how, not the physical safety, but the psychological safety, which connects to the emotional labour that you spoke of. And I wanted to ask you, whilst reflecting on what your thoughts are, I guess, on this balance between academic investigation, which is the traditional, it's inaccessible, it's connected to institutions, it's connected to months-long processes that are actually only accessible to the very few of us, versus the accessibility and democracy and openness of digital spaces, but that lack the robustness that you spoke about roughly, kind of briefly in your keynote. You spoke about our peer review process and our idea of just having this rigorous process that takes way too long, which is part of the inaccessibility, but it does lead to robustness. We move away from that because very few have access to it, to a space that's digital because it's much more open, but then lacks the rigorous nature that we kind of rely on in order to allow for this debate and this kind of thorough look at history. And I really would love to know from all of you, if we've got time, how you feel about this balance between robustness and truth and process versus accessibility and digital spaces and the majority. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a real question.
I again, I don't know. I think it's something that all of us, because again, when looking at the digital space, I still think it's very new as well. I think in the past 5 years alone, from 2020 to now, the types of conversations that are being had, even on just like people say, yo, my social batteries run out. That's a new thing, but thing that we felt for a long time, but we didn't know how to express it. You hear young people talk about anxiety and depression and so on. Like, these are very new conversations, even though it's not a new feeling. It's that openness of talking. And now that you're finding like Black academics, Nadia Hussein, who's on Great British Bake Off, right? Love her. And I saw a video the other day, she's coming out, and basically the BBC does what the BBC does, and I believe she got fired or something. I don't know the details, but what I saw was her video, and she was talking about people were complaining that she should be grateful for the opportunity and all the exposure that she got and so on. And she says she's been having to wear this labor of gratitude her whole life because her parents were saying, you must be thankful for this food, and you must be thankful for this, and you must be thankful for that. So it was almost like she was indebted gratitude all the time, so it did not allow her to call people out when they were disrespecting her, because she had to be grateful for the opportunity as a woman and a woman of color to be on the BBC and on TV and so on. And I think that's something that I think all of us, storytellers, historians, whatever, content creators, whatever, feel like we always have to be grateful. Like, oh, I'm very grateful for. I'll tell you a quick story. This is with the National Maritime Museum. I've been working with them for about 4 years or so, and my first experience with them was doing this unboxing, and so we had a whole thing where they brought a bunch of us in, and we were unboxing some of their pieces from their collection. This was like during the pandemic. Things were all kind of funny, and then I felt really grateful, like, wow, they put 4 Black women in a private room in this museum, and we're going to unbox this thing, and they're going to film us and take our opinions. Like, wow. And then I went home and I was bawling, I was crying, I was depressed. I was like, you know, it's my partner at the time bring ice cream for me because I was so sad at the end of it all. I did not feel grateful. I did not feel happy. And that's not to negate from the work that's necessary, because I came back 3-4 times doing the same thing again. But so to answer your question, in terms of the digital space, it's still very new. So like, say for my relationship with New York Caribbean, like, I'm grateful because I learned so much in the comments. Sometimes people correct me. So people say, no, actually, it's not so. And then I'll be like, oh, could you DM me? And people will send me. And I'm so grateful for these conversations, but I still feel it's very, very new. And people like applaud the platform a lot. And I have to be very clear. The platform is not Fiona. The platform is everybody who's engaging, commenting, sharing, this and this. That's what it is. So I still feel like it's very new, our relationship, and having those nuanced conversations still have a lot more time to grow. And I think even, again, we're still decolonizing how we present, because I remember when I started, someone I was very close to said, Fiona, why are you talking like that? Like, why are you talking like a solution? You need to present yourself like National Geographic, so people can respect you more. And then one of the things people love the most is like how I talk. Yeah. That I don't change my accent, that I speak in a certain way. One day you'll see me whining, one day I'm talking about some very serious thing. And I think it's breaking out of that colonial space and how we present ourselves on these digital platforms to be presented. And we're still in that infancy.
I want to go to the questions, but I'm going to answer your question because it's such a good question. And I have so much to say about it that I probably need to speak to you after this because it might take too long. But I think that kind of, that tension and that balance between the academic, rigorous, and also sometimes the unhelpful processes when you're trying to do work that is felt. You're trying to do work that has impact. Are you trying to do work that's engaging with particular voices and experiences that have been erased or that has been ignored, intentionally ignored, was a huge challenge. It's still a huge ongoing challenge for me when I work within institutions, universities specifically. But I also think that there's an element that I arrived to particularly towards the final point of like my PhD process, where I was like, Bon Babylon. Because
PhD title.
which happens to be my PhD title of Bon Babylon. Because the structure that we're working within a system of structural absence, and quite often the universities enforce these things such as ethic forms and all of these things, and it's like, but who is it for? Well, how is it helping us? And especially when I think about a role as a historian, it's a very emotional labor that goes into it. I was doing like a project on like the therapy of being a historian, and how I realized that a lot of the time I was going around London documenting some very painful, heavy stories. I'm like, where do I go with this? I can't just, you know what I mean? So for me, I feel like one level of it is like having a lot more confidence and just that kind of unapologetic nature of saying, no, we're going to start from over this and not from over yassa. But then also, as historians, we've got a lot more work to do in engaging with this discourse outside of this kind of ivory tower, as you would say. So when I go onto like Instagram, there's a lot of misinformation out there. If I spend my time looking online at so how many articles, I'm like, this is wrong. The rigor is not, like, nah, I can't keep on correcting things. But we have responsibility to not just the students, to not just our professors and our supervisors, but to everybody. So I think there's that question for me that's like so important, is like, who are we in conversation with? Who is our work in conversation with? And what is the questions that we're asking? But I'm going to ask some more questions because I'm conscious of time. We've got one at the front as well. Two at the front, sorry.
So my name is Stuart Taylor. I represent several projects. One of them is called the Unmuseum, based in Bristol. Another is called Dances with Wisdom, which is a cultural and leadership consultancy based here in London. And a third is Ujamaa Systemic Healing, which is a therapeutic and decolonial praxis project. And I don't have a question for you. I have some short reflections. And the first of those reflections is looking at who's in the room and what the building is that this room is within. And what I mean by that reflection is, I don't imagine there are too many fans of Closer magazine or of EastEnders or of Millwall Football Club, for example. And this is not a criticism in any shape or form, but it's a question of the racialization of space and the spatialization of race. Where we are and who is in this room is a reflection of the fundamental problematic that we're all involved in interrogating and addressing and at some level trying to resolve, even though it's an infinitely unresolvable problematic, because none of us will live or can live long enough to resolve it. But what we can do, I believe, and I think all of you and many of the people in this room this evening are doing, is lay down waymarkers, because the issue of academic rigor, the issue of historical substantiveness, these are all questions which are appropriate to ask, but we are asking them of a very well established establishment, and creating alternative spaces where this discourse can take place, and where there are then practical resources that can be created and made available for a wider public that aren't directly engaged in this process. It's not their professional intention. It's not their practical, everyday consideration. So it's important that we periodically remind ourselves of the relatively exclusive space we inhabit in undertaking this work, in having a discourse about the impacts on ourselves and on the wider community of the findings of the work that we undertake. So of course there's much, much more one can say about all of these facets, but I'll unconclude by thanking you all for your work and your passion and your vision and your resilience and your strength.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Nubia. I'm an author and filmmaker, and I wanted to ask if any of you four could offer a solution to an issue that Fiona highlighted, being that even though the digital social media space is one of access, being that we can communicate with people that we wouldn't, within our diaspora, that we wouldn't be able to connect with physically. However, I think what it does, it flattens out the terrain whereby we can acknowledge the space in which we're coming from, whether that be a diasporan or someone that's never left the Caribbean or someone from Benin or Congo, and essentially asking how can we bring the framework of reasoning into the digital space. And I guess like the reason why this is difficult is because we access social media individually via personal devices. So, you know, it becomes a unilateral process where we enter our phones and we're like, I want to take something away from this time and this space. And so people come onto social media spaces or pages like Fiona's, waiting to feel acknowledged or seen and like directly spoken to. So how do we bring like a collective, discursive, reasoning framework into the digital space?
I actually think, and this is to big up House of Dread, I think this is the answer, and I think this is also going to answer one of the previous questions about academia and the digital world, and you know what is the meeting of the middle. And I think the crux of it, the healing crux of it, is community. What we're doing right now in coming out to these spaces and having these discussions is the bridge between, you know, the academic rigor and the community we find online, but which can only go to an extent, because at the end of the day, when you're sitting behind your phone, you have no one to really discuss with after that. It's kind of an end point. But engaging with academia, engaging with the digital realm, and then coming to events like this and really thinking about what House of Dread are doing as an anti-disciplinary community is what's really, really important. And it takes me back to, I think it was earlier this week, it's been a long week, I apologize. I can't remember if it was last week or this week. I was working on an introductory film for our school project with the really wonderful actor Patterson Joseph and the art historian Michael Ohajuru, who I've noticed is in the audience. I was like, is that Michael? And we've created, you know, I really recommend as well Michael Ohajuru's book, Who is John Blank? It's an incredible book which brings together historians and artists and everything else. But we were working together on a short film, and it's a film that's going to be shown in schools, Key Stage 3 and whatever else. And the reason why we've come together to create this short film was because, you know, in the creating of our physical, digital curriculum materials, which are fantastic, there needed to be this digital element that we are in a digital world right now where our young people engage more with the digital. And so we felt that we should create a short film that they can watch in the classroom and hopefully then have discussion and build community in the classroom. So I do think that the bridge between academia and the bridge between the digital realm, kind of not feeling, as you said, unilateral, is community, and House of Dread are doing this so perfectly. So thank you.
So I agree completely, but this is to big up Know Your Caribbean, which is that, you know, I think we have to think of the media work we do, digital media work, as just one part of a total ecology of community. Right. So, you know, Fiona's obviously also organizing Carnival. Like if you walk with her in the streets of St. Lucia, she's talking to people. And she brings that spirit of community into the platform itself. She models that community building even on the platform. So that, you know, it may be when people are engaging Know Your Caribbean as a site, as a platform, they're engaging it through their phones. But what they're seeing there is a spirit of community building and community organizing that Fiona is engaging with beyond the platform itself. That's what makes that platform what it is. So you just think of that as one element in a much larger practice, and it does exactly that kind of community building work.
Fiona is also hosting a reading retreat, and I wanted to shout that out. Because, yeah, I'll pick up everyone, but you are also building community, and so Professor Brown is completely correct there.
Thank you. But real quick, Kane, don't kill me. But to talk about community, I must big up Kane Kawasaki. If you do not follow him, please do. But Kane is a great example of building community online, because Kane is an educator, and he does so in such a way that I feel like I'm talking to my brethren. So when I met Kane for the first time, I felt like very like, yo, like, what's up? Like, it's how he communicates that history, and he speaks about things like as a community, not like in 1764. No, it's not like that at all. He's like, yeah, what's going on, people? Yo, did you know like this? And then now he does lives all the time that engages people, asking people questions. What do you think? Doing polls. And I know he did a recent thing where he did a community fundraiser, and it was with Notting Hill Carnival. A lot of people don't know why we started it and everything like that. And it's, it's a murder of a Caribbean man, Kelso Cochrane. And he said, yo, let's do a giant billboard like in the middle of Notting Hill. Let's put the money together ourselves as a community. And, through Kane's work, the money was raised in a day and a half. It wasn't months of begging. And then, now, so right on top of Ladbroke Grove, in the most iconic location, is this massive billboard honoring Kelso Cochrane and contextualizing the reason why Carnival started. So, to answer your question, I think Kane is a great example of showing like how you can extend or create a community, not just outside the digital space, but through the digital space, and creating like tangible moments. And when he did the launch, another thing he did, he had everyone come in. Well, how well do you think you know Carnival? Like on a scale of 1 to 10, and you give it to, like, say if you like 5 and up, you get a green band, and if it's like 5 and below, you get a red band. I'll say I'd like you with the green band to go and talk to someone in the red band. And so then to spread and support that information in like a place we were liming, there were parties, there was drinks, and whatever. And so it was I think Kane's work is a perfect example of creating that like tangible community feeling.
Big up Kane.
Sorry.
No, that's good. But I think also what you're speaking to and what this practice reflects as well, and just kind of following on from your question, is like the importance of peer learning. And I think sometimes there's a challenge with that on social media, because people want something that they can package, and people want something that, you can sell. But I think the importance of even this network that the Mayor of London has commissioned is at the heart of this network is about learning. And even at the beginning of like when House of Dread took the thing, I was like, what, just learn it? That's all, you don't want any outputs? Like, what's the thing? It's just like conversations. And I think centering like the question of, reasoning and how we can use that as a methodology within this digital realm is also just tuning our minds into the shared learning from a kind of peer, horizontal platform point of view, and kind of really disrupting this desire to be selling and extracting something, which is what tends to happen. We're going to take a few more questions because I'm conscious of time. So I will ask, please, if you're asking a question or a reflection, to make it snappy.
Hi.
Thank you, Fiona.
I think there's an order. Hi, my name's Miranda Kaufman. It's great to be here. I wanted to push back on this idea that there's no Black history in schools at the moment. Michael and I actually went to this really inspiring. We went to this teaching conference in Liverpool in May, the Historical Association, big teaching conference, and it was really refreshing because there were loads of teachers there who were really keen to teach Black history. There was a whole session on setting up a Caribbean history GCSE, and they had these fantastic ideas about that. So in a way, I think the next generation are doing all right. It's more like the voters and the adults that need re-educating right now, and that's where I think museums are a problematic but potential venue. So I want to sort of go back to St. Peter's, because I want to know what's going on in Dorchester now in that church and in that museum. Is it still in a box? What's happened on the wall? And both of those places are venues, because I think if we're going to further this conversation, it can happen online, but it really needs to happen in person if we want to forge understanding, if we want to dance together. Maybe we should get the line dancer to mix it up with the soccer music and see if we can all dance together and maybe come together in in some of these spaces. And I don't know, so I guess my question, is what would you like to see happen in that church in Dorchester and in that museum in Dorchester? I'm thinking maybe we get the school kids in there with their phones and get them to make some Instagram content based on whatever happens there.
Yeah. I mean, as far as I know, there's still a gap in the wall where that memorial plaque was. That is now in a museum, kind of locked away and not on display yet, but available to view upon request. And so then the question is, whoever knows to request that, right? So I would love to see the film playing in the church. I don't think that's going to happen. But I would love to see a greater awareness about these kinds of memorials, not just at that church, but all over the place, right? So if the Mapping London project, for example, had some outlet where people had a better sense, a broader sense of how London is connected historically to all of these unlikely places, they would go to look for things like that memorial plaque, and not only that one. So, I guess my ambition is that we expand people's sense of the historical geography of this place, so it can really encompass, the history of empire and beyond. And here's just a very brief, I'll try to make this very brief story. Like when I was first researching this stuff in the 1990s, I was staying with a friend of mine who was from India, who was married to a white British man. And when he learned what I was working on, he said, yeah, so why is it that Jamaicans speak English in the first place? And his wife, who was Indian, said, colonialism, you bloody idiot. Why the hell do you think I speak English? Right? And it was, hers was a very British response, I thought. Right? But also, I mean, what happened? He was a college-educated guy. And what happened after decolonization was British universities largely stopped teaching the history of empire and started teaching the history of Great Britain as this kind of, island chain off the European peninsula again. And so people, even college-educated people, had no idea what was going on when people started showing up from South Asia or from the Caribbean or from Africa, right? Because they thought Britain was in some way self-contained. They didn't understand the real historical geography of the place in which they lived. So I think the more we can do to get people to understand those historical connections, the more they'll seek out these kinds of monuments and want to know their stories.
Thank you. Yes.
I just want to make a very, very quick clarification in line with your comment, Randa. It's so good to see you, and hopefully we'll get to talk after. When I said Black history isn't in schools, I was really talking about on a political level. So in history, there is no mandate to teach Black history, just making that clear. The only kind of requirement is the Holocaust, nothing else. And the only reason now why this generation are really pushing for that, and we're seeing, modules like on migration finally coming out and things like that, is because of community networks. The one that's coming to my head is the Black Curriculum, yes, are an organization who have come together to resist against what the government haven't done, which is make a requirement for Black history. And so that's what I really mean. The labor is put on teachers. Teachers have a very, very small window where they get an opportunity to teach what they want or bring in, because right now we've created a 6-week scheme of work and we're trying to get schools to pilot it. So if you're a teacher, come see me at the end. Things like that, we have to do that to try and get people to pilot lessons on Black history. So it's really, really through that. And so what I would really say is we cannot be content, even though it's so good to see that our generation are hopefully changing things, we still cannot be content until we see that Black history is mandated in the curriculum. And that is because black people in Britain are British. Black history is British history. There should be no segregation between which history is which history. We are Black and we're British, and so therefore it's just history. It should just be history. So I just wanted to make that small clarification.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 5 minutes.
Hi.
I was going to say 5-10 minutes. 5 minutes. So please.
Hello, my name is Charlotte. I've got 2 questions. One, sometimes I do talks about slavery in the post office, and it can sometimes I find it difficult because I get very angry, and at the same time, also it can be, I don't want to horrify people too much as well. So, so it's that kind of, how do you say it safely when I speak to people who are Japanese, English, or Black, or African American? Second question was also towards Professor Brown. What happened to the statue of the man who was that so-called father of gynecology who experimented on Black women? What happened to that? And thirdly, sorry, one more second. Sorry about this. I speak to some Americans and they tell me that the Museum of African America, that stuff is getting missing now because of the administration.
Okay, 2 questions and a provocation?
So I don't know what happened to that statue, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author. Sadly, this is being videotaped, so this is going to be for the world to see that I don't remember her name. But there's a book that I'm thinking of, and as soon as I can remember it, I can contact you about it. She would know exactly what's happening to that statue. A lot of confusion about what's happening at museums. What we know is that there are executive orders to try and transform museums so that they're not teaching what the Trump administration considers to be woke history, which is really just kind of any kind of history they don't like, and they are racial nationalists. And so for the most part, they are beginning to demand that curators take things out. Harriet Tubman's Bible has gone. They have first and foremost focused on kind of recent history. So they took out of the Smithsonian Museum, I believe, references to January 6th and what Donald Trump was doing on January 6th. So across the board, they're starting to make some subtle, some more dramatic changes to try and reshape the historical consciousness of the public. And curators are crying out about it, but not clear we're going to be able to stop it before a lot of those changes are made.
Thank you.
There's so many questions, I know.
We're just, yeah.
So we're going to go, and I think there's one more if we've got time.
Okay.
Email us your questions.
Thank you very much, the panel. My name is Nikki, for all your insights. It's been uplifting. My question was one with regards to AI. And if this is a space where certain voices have been excluded, then jumping on an AI bandwagon that is an amalgamation of other voices, does that pose a risk in the future? So I guess that's one.
Yes.
And second question, the title, the digital is black. Does that mean we are now raising the white flag in terms of holding other institutions to account?
That doesn't mean I'm answering the question, Because I'm not answering the question. I'm leaving it to y'all.
Yeah, I think that's why. So I kind of consider myself, as you probably figured out, a methodological conservative among the radicals, right? Because I think things like kind of chain of evidence, provenance, are extremely important, right? To be able to go back to kind of the original source of a thing and to be able to show your work and tell people, this is how we know what we know, right? We can argue over that, but we've got to go back and find the sources and figure out together what those sources mean. Simply trusting, kind of layers and layers and layers of interpretation then piled on by the digital is not a satisfying method to me, right? So I'm consistently asking people to slow down and show us, the postcards, right? Show us the postcards, as Fiona does. How do we know this is what this looked like when that postcard was made? Let's talk about that. So that's important to me. Deirdre Cooper Owens wrote that book. Just to go back to the source.
I'm looking at the time.
We have to wrap up. We do have one question.
Okay.
It's from our videographer, so let's allow him.
Dangerous. Anti-discipline. I'm stepping out my role as a videographer, but also to not be too disciplined. It's also... Oh, my name's George, by the way. Nice to meet everyone. I just want to throw a spanner at the title, and one thing that I can't leave this room kind of not speaking on is the digital black? Because as we kind of know, our internet providers aren't black.
Right.
Our the data centers aren't black.
Yeah.
The only black thing in there are probably the materials of where that all comes from. And we know that, to say at the moment, we talk about colonialism, we're at a land grab as it kind of is. If you look at what steps people like Elon Musk are making, where it's like taking over a digital public space like Twitter to make it X, or to put in the new way that we are going to get our internet, which is through Starlink. So I just want to pose that question of how do we ensure that the future of digital will be black and can be black? Because and I think this question came out because I think when you said that one thing about the digital is accessibility, and I felt like in the room uplifted that we all find sanctuary on this space, and before we kind of find and really hone in on that sanctuary, I think there's a few things that maybe we need to think about. So how can we ensure that the future of digital is black?
What a beautiful question as a last question to end. Because it's a very beautiful question. Thank you for asking, George. And the title is more of a provocation than it is a statement. Because we know the isms and schisms that is involved in what it means when you put information online. And the online world and the digital world being this double-edged tool, right? This double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have access. On the one hand, you're kind of creating and building community. But then on the other hand, who does it belong to? Where does it go? And as archivists who are in the room, this is a constant challenge thinking about, digital archiving and preservation and provenance work, et cetera, et cetera. So to answer the last part of your question, obviously, everybody tune in. But I think, once again, it has to go back to that critical engagement with the question. What is the question that we're asking when we're engaging online, documenting, talking about our stories, our histories, in a way that's not, as Abira was kind of speaking to, not just showing that black as this critique of whiteness, because we know that blackness is not just a critique of whiteness, that actually a lot of the work that we're trying to center is more affirming, kind of developing more of those affirmative methodologies of who we are and what we know and how we live and how we move. But then there's also an element of, asking yourself those questions, those critical engagement with the questions. What is the question? Who is the audience? And then also, how can we gather? Because I'm a bit ambivalent, as much as we're doing this event, but I'm a bit ambivalent towards the digital world. Because for me, I like community. I like in our real life things. I'm weary of that. I'm a bit, I guess I'm a bit kind of like, who is it for and what we're trying to achieve? And I think reclaiming, and I guess this is part of the kind of reclaiming of that narrative, is really trying to kind of build that critical discourse in the work that we're doing and the people that we're engaging with.
Can I say, I'm a literature student kind of at my foundation, so I want to say something alternative, because it takes me back to a chapter of my thesis where I defined digital or technologies completely different to how we might see it. So I would argue that the digital is black, because one part of my work looks at indigenous history, right? Going back to kind of indigenous African people and the ways that they communicated. My entire research looks at how slavery formed a relationship between black humanity and the non-human world, so animals, nature, and the spiritual realm, right? And when I think about technology, I think about forms of communication. I think about forms of transferring messages between. And so I would actually argue that the digital or technology, however you're thinking about technologies, is black at its core from the beginning, because indigenous black people, enslaved African people, found ways to communicate with the non-human world that completely kind of transferred messages in different ways. And we see that with acts of resistance. That's why I love your book, and I would absolutely recommend reading and buying Professor Brown's book on Taki's Revolt, because that also inspired one of my chapters on Alex Wheatl's Cane Warriors, which looks at Taki's Revolt, so you feature heavily in that chapter, I must say. But even just thinking about different types of acts of resistance, right? Where enslaved African women would create their own or alternative ways of communication and language to transfer messages. And I used the language as describing that as technology, as technologies. And so I think at its very foundation, in terms of resistance, not just resistance, but also survival, I would say that the digital is black, but I do think it depends on how you're defining it. I think it's a brilliant question. I want to say, preach!
It's a creativity as well. It's part of that as well.
I mean, I can only speak about like my relationship. So I guess my relationship with digital and then blackness and identity or whatever started really with Know Your Caribbean, right? And it's like a constant fight, because you could say the existence of the platform is resistance. It's like, okay, it's Zuckerberg and all of them people and them, and I'm fighting and having a say. But me, I'm under constant threat. Do you know how many times I've been threatened by Instagram? You violated. I cannot do certain things in my link tree to expand outside of Instagram because they block it, because they say I'm soliciting arms or I'm a terrorist or whatever. And then sometimes like posts would just disappear and they won't even tell you. So I'm like, am I mad? So it's like this constant threat, and then also fighting the algorithm, which a thing you always hear in these new things. This is a new way to get more views. You must do this, you must do that. So I always like, okay, I'm always fighting the space that was not created for us, for especially the type of information that we want to put out, for it to get those views. So that's why a lot of times things that reach far, Know Your Caribbean, is because people quarreling. So it's salacious, it's divisive, it's, you know, it's as we say, it's bacchanal and things like that. And that's frustrating. So I'm like, when certain things go viral, and it's like, it's not going viral for the right reasons. And then it's further amplifying a thing that is not a space that's for us in a way that we want it to be. So that's that constant threat from these looming people who are just monitoring and even curating my own work without me having a say, right? Things just going to say, where's that post? I say, what, yo? So it's like, that constant threat makes me question, like, how black can we make it if there is this, if they're controlling me through the algorithm or literally deleting my work or telling me, if you post again, anything to do with this, we will delete your page. I even did a backup page, thing just disappeared, they said as violating or whatever. Like, so, you know, it's, I find it difficult, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop. I think it's constantly still pushing and resisting anyway, because we have to anyway.
Okay. That brings us to the end. I want to thank all of you for being in conversation. I'm feeling so nourished and inspired. Professor Vincent Brown, Fiona Compton, Dr. Renee Landell. And I also want to thank the National Maritime Museum for allowing us to host this as well, especially Charlotte, who also has an event tomorrow, the International Slave Remembrance Day. So if you are in town, please do come along to that. And I want to thank the team as well, Nana and George and Melissa as well for helping us. Melissa and Lucia. And that takes us to the end, but we're not finished yet. No, we have finished. We have finished. And thank me. Yes, thank me. So we are very much pushed for time. So please, I know we encourage conversation, but conversations are slightly moving towards the door. Do follow our...
But you can't stay here.
Exactly. Do follow our mailing list. Sign up to our mailing list. Keep up to date with what we're doing. Thank you so much.